Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. As I mentioned yesterday, Dr. Paul is traveling for much of this week, so I'm able to bring in some of my favorite guests to help me through these episodes. And today, one of my very favorites is joining us, and that's Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa is an independent journalist. Unlike most journalists who are writing about Syria, she actually goes there. It's a novel idea. But she goes there and reports from on the ground. We had her on about Aleppo a few months ago. Of course, everything she said turned out to be absolutely correct. She's an independent journalist. She writes for 21st Century Wire, among other places. Vanessa, we're so happy to have you with us.
It's lovely to be back on with you, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you, and you get people irritated, which is good, which is what you're supposed to do. All of the people that are ensconced in their comfy positions as court journalists do not like having people on the ground. And so you got all the right enemies. But there are a few things that we want to go over today. Syria is back in the news. Apparently Assad woke up again and decided he just had to gas some people. He just couldn't help himself. Some fantastic, wonderful filmmakers are out there telling us about the glories of the white helmets again. They're being feted in Davos and all these places. So we need to talk about a few of these things. You had a piece recently in 21st Century Wire about this new film glorifying the white helmets, the so-called Syrian civil defense. Why don't you let us know a little bit about what you wrote about, what the controversy is, and where you see things right now?
Well, I think it's important to break this down into two parts, as I did with the articles myself. First of all, of course, you're quite right. This is another film like the Netflix White Helmet documentary that is showcasing this organization, as you say, promoting the fraudulently named Syria Civil Defense, because there's an existing Syria Civil Defense that was established in Syria in 1953. That's number one. But it's also actually glorifying, or let's say whitewashing at the very least, the role of Nusra Front in East Aleppo. Throughout this film, as I've described in the article that I've just written, reviewing or critiquing the film, throughout this movie, the role of Nusra Front and associated terrorist entities who were occupying the areas of East Aleppo for 4.5 years, incarcerating Syrian civilians, using them as hostages, human shields, imprisoning them, crucifying them, according to civilian testimony, particularly from children who had to witness these atrocities. According to Last Men in Aleppo, Nusra Front don't exist. The terrorist entities don't exist. They're never described. They're never talked about. The only criminal described by Last Men in Aleppo is, of course, the Syrian government and its allies, despite the fact that when I actually went to East Aleppo January this year, I walked around the area where this film was made predominantly, which was in the Al Ansari district of East Aleppo, where the White Helmet Center featured in the movie is located. And I've actually produced a film myself showing that White Helmet Center is next door, first of all, to Nusra Front, to the Nusra Front Center in that district of East Aleppo, then next to Abu Amada, which was another terrorist brigade, actually the security agents for Nusra Front. There's the usual graffiti showing the ISIS flag, showing the Free Syrian Army, so-called moderate extremist flag, in the surrounding buildings to the White Helmet Center. But then more importantly, almost, if you walk, and I've actually filmed that walk to show how short it is, if you walk from the White Helmet Center featured in Last Men in Aleppo, about 200 meters down the road, you arrive at the Al-Mashhad circle or area where, in fact, Nour al-Din Zinki extremist organization, supported by the United States government, beheaded the 12-year-old Palestinian child Abdullah Isa in July 2016. But then if we move on to the second part of my article series, What I've done is to delve into those who are enabling, processing, producing both of these movies on the White Helmets. And this comes to an organization called Doc Society, which used to be called BritDoc, which has now changed its name even. Now, this organization is responsible for the production of a huge variety of documentaries showcasing geopolitical events and from a particular perspective, let's say. But in the case of the White Helmets, of course, we've seen the Netflix documentary and now Last Men in Aleppo that have, without question, lobbied for, advocated, and endorsed this organization without ever addressing the multitude of accusations being leveled against this organization, predominantly by the Syrian civilians who've lived under their occupation and have described them as Nusra Front civil defense, but also evidence that's been produced through their own video footage. And the video footage coming from the Nusra Front affiliated organizations described in Western media as moderate rebels, freedom bringers, democracy supporters, etc. And so this organization, Doc Society, which has, as I said, followed the whole process of the promotion and production of these films, both of them, their founding partner is Channel 4. One of their major partners is the BBC, the Bertha Foundation, and Sundance Institute, which most people in the United States will recognize as being Robert Redford's organization. Now, these organizations have therefore been instrumental in this lionization of this organization and fundamentally, as I said, the whitewashing of their connections and affiliation to extremist groups inside Syria.
You know, it's interesting in looking through, especially your most recent article. There's such a tangled web of NGOs and pseudo-NGOs. There's this foundation and that foundation. Is this by design, and who's really behind this? I noticed you point out that the Sundance Foundation does have open society money, but who else is behind this? Who's footing the bill for this? This must be a massive operation, and why do you think they're doing it?
Well, I mean, I think, and I've been considering this for a long time, you know, why is the White Helmets as an organization being so dramatically defended and protected by these organizations, by corporate and state-sanctioned media outlets, by NATO-aligned NGOs, including the UN? And actually, probably what will come up in the third part of this series is the Sundance connections, not only to Open Society Foundation, but Sundance sort of handed the baton over to an organization called Grasshopper Films, which is part of Grasshopper Global. Now, Grasshopper Global has clear connections to the UN Foundation, also to Walt Disney, I hasten to add. But the UN Foundation, again, having done my research, that leads me actually directly back to the Clintons, to Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, and to their foundation, to the Clinton Global Initiative. So it's very clear to me that the White Helmets is not just the 3,000 volunteers inside Syria that come from the extremist and terrorist organizations themselves. This is a concept, and it's a concept that I believe will be repeated globally. We've seen James Mazurier, the creator of the White Helmets, recently recruiting for the intermediary that acts as a sort of conduit for the British government funds to go to the White Helmets. And that organization is called Mayday Rescue. Now, he was recently in Brazil, for example, recruiting in Brazil for Mayday Rescue. So we know that there is potential of them establishing a similar organization in Brazil. We know that they've appeared in Venezuela. We know that they've appeared in Indonesia and in the Philippines. So we're seeing the creation of a construct which is recognized to be, a phony first response organization, but which is portrayed as a real first response organization, and as James Mazurier said, will gain the trust of the societies into which it is being introduced. So the construct is, I believe, very important for the imperialist machine.
Well, James Missouri himself is a spook, isn't he? I mean, isn't that his background? I mean, sorry to be
Yeah, I
so
mean,
crude about it, but so here's a guy, he's a spook, and it looks like what he's coming up with is really regime change 3.0. You know, we saw
yeah.
very early on, we saw the color revolutions, and then you had to turn it up a notch, and so you had, well, you developed things like Otpor for Serbia and the other various, you know, closed fist organizations. They tried it in Belarus and elsewhere. And now this seems to be a new iteration. It gets, unfortunately, more and more violent with each one. Am I
Yeah.
right? Is this sort of a new way to do regime change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the first Sea Lord, the British first Sea Lord, who said very recently that in future conflicts, I mean, you know, we've heard about hybrid wars, we've heard about multi-spectrum wars, etc. But he made a very clear statement that in the future, the military aspect of conflict is going to be the military punch will be in the velvet glove of humanitarian organizations. I mean, he said it slightly differently, but that's pretty much what he was saying. And you're quite right about James Le Mesurier, who has been present in most intervention arenas, as you say. But let's look at the parallels between also the KLA, for example, morphing into the Kosovo Security Corps. Now, James Le Mesurier was definitely, to my knowledge, and from his fairly shady, shadowy bios, he was definitely present during that NATO intervention, for example. So I think we're just seeing the development of that concept to how it is now. And also, interestingly, when I was in Syria this time and I was investigating the propaganda from day one, so from 2011 to 2013, initially it was carried out by the mainstream media itself, i.e. CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, etc. Then they started to be rumbled, right, around 2013, when actually the terrorists carried out the first chemical weapons attack against the Syrian army and civilians in Khan al-Assal in March 2013, which coincided with the Russian and Chinese vetoes on Syria and with the creation of the White Helmet. So for me, what the media did at this point, knowing that they were probably going to be producing the chemical weapon false flags, they created the White Helmets and other embedded Al-Qaeda-affiliated media activists and journalists in order to provide a sort of plausible deniability for the media in using that propaganda.
You know, it's chilling, and it really is kind of a marriage between the neocons who love violent conflict overseas and the humanitarianists, and that brings in so-called humanitarianists, and that brings in the Clinton Foundation. This kind of thing has Hillary's hands all over it. You know, it was Hillary who weaponized the State Department really and turned it into a regime change vehicle. She was a driving force behind the Libya liberation, and she was heavily involved early on in Syria. So this really has a mark of an unholy alliance between these two factions.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Clinton, as you quite rightly, has her fingers in almost every one of these organizations, either directly or indirectly. I would need to go back through my research, but I believe she was involved in the Democracy Council, which in turn set up an organization called ACU, and ACU is another one of these organizations that is effectively siphoning money into the White Helmets and into the local councils, into the Free Syrian Police, etc.
Well, it makes you wonder. You know, we thought that maybe she lost the presidency, but it seems like her foreign policy lives on, and in fact, you know, increases. But you know, attacking the White Helmets is akin to, I don't know, attacking some sacred relic or something. You know, you take a lot of heat for attacking the White Helmets.
Yeah.
Yet you have so much evidence that they're involved with people we are supposed to be against, supposed to be at war with.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's almost it's an extraordinary degree of stonewalling that goes on if anybody even raises questions about the White Helmets, and apparently that also happens if you raise questions about them in Parliament itself. Baroness Caroline Cox has been raising some very pertinent questions, for example, in the House of Lords. And the responses have been, at the very least, obfuscating the financing of this organization, which has been basically coming from taxpayer funds within the Conflict Stability and Security Fund that has been putting around 200 million in the last 3 years into what is euphemistically called the Syrian opposition. So, the recent article in The Guardian attacking those who are exposing the white helmets as being no more than Russian trolls and agents. This was just one of the most, I'm almost speechless in trying to describe how poorly researched this article was. I mean, Ava Bartlett has done an extraordinarily good deconstruction of that article, and I would recommend reading it. But, for example, yesterday, the same author, Olivia Solon, who's based in San Francisco, has never been to Syria, to my knowledge, and is a technology expert. In fact, she was tweeting out about vegan dog and cat food the other day. So, I mean, that explains. Yeah. And she basically wrote another article yesterday, and she's put her Twitter account again under a protected status. But she wrote an article yesterday accusing Russia of hacking the Oscars.
Oh, no,
because,
not the Oscars.
I mean, because, Last Men in Aleppo is, of course, nominated for the Oscars. And so now we're told the Russians are hacking the Oscars.
The thing that makes me at least the most frustrated, I'm sure you feel the same way, is how just a second of reflection would seem to undermine the whole issue of something like the white helmets. Okay, here's a bunch of guys. Okay, this is the story. Here's a bunch of guys. They dress up, they put on helmets, and they rescue people that are stuck in bombed out places. Okay, that sounds great. So a bunch of volunteers running around rescuing people. Why do they need a several $100 million budget? I don't get it. Are they driving around in Rolls Royces, or why do they need this much money? Anyone can volunteer to rescue people.
Yeah, let me give you an indication now, because actually one of the things I investigated this last trip to Syria was the accounts of the real Syria civil defense that are actually operating in over 80% of the inhabited areas of Syria. So they're serving 80% of Syrian civilians, when you bear in mind that probably 7 million internally displaced people are gravitating towards those areas that are government secured. Now, the real Syria civil defense has almost exactly the same number of volunteers as the White Helmets claims to have. It has an operating budget. We went through it piece by piece. It has an annual operating budget of $1.5 million. The White Helmets has an operating budget, according to their job descriptions, of $35 million. Now, this is just, it's grotesque, because the real Syria civil defense are actually doing the job that the White Helmets claim to be doing. They're having their name stolen. They're being targeted by the terrorists that the White Helmets are working with. I visited the real Syria civil defense depot in Le Ramoun in Aleppo and heard how the terrorists that the White Helmets were embedded with were targeting that center over 10 times a day with mortars, with snipers. Many of their crew members were assassinated. And if we're talking about double tap, what they told me was that they would get called out to a terrorist attack on the civilians in West Aleppo, and then when they got there, the terrorists would then target them as soon as they arrived. So, what we should actually be seeing in Western media is a complete inverse of what we're seeing. Do you know what I mean? I mean, the double tap technology, which they are constantly accusing the Syrian government of carrying out against what are effectively terrorist organizations in Idlib, is probably the biggest pocket of terrorism left inside Syria right now. Yeah. Those double tap, those chemical weapon attacks are being carried out against the Syrian Arab Army and against the genuine, authentic Syria civil defense.
Well, the best gauge is how people vote, and they vote with their feet. In your experience, and you've been there, you spent a lot of time in Syria, do people that have been displaced, have you seen any of them coming back to areas where the White Helmets are active?
Oh, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. In fact, most people that have not lived, let's say, in terrorist occupied areas will tell you they don't even know who the white helmets are, because they have no experience of their activities. Those that have lived, like in East Aleppo, under their occupation and under their brutal regime alongside Nusra Front will tell you that they are Nusra Front civil defense. They didn't help civilians. In fact, they were active in increasing the suffering of Syrian civilians in those occupied areas. And actually, when I was in Hama, which is one of the provinces neighboring Idlib, I spoke to refugees from Idlib who'd fled in March 2015 when the terrorists invaded and massacred many civilians and Syrian Arab army. And one girl that I spoke to, whose father got the family to safety at that point and went back to try and get some belongings. He was captured by Nusra Front and he was beheaded. When I showed her the footage that I had of the white helmets alongside Nusra Front at that time in Idlib, she could, one, absolutely locate where they were. And she said, yes, we saw them. We saw them alongside Nusra Front when they came into Idlib city. So those same terrorists that beheaded her father were working with the white helmets, and she recognized the uniform and she recognized, the fact that they had been alongside Nusra Front. They had certainly not been separate, and they'd certainly not been helping the civilians who were being brutalized by Nusra Front during that invasion and occupation.
Well, what do they know? They only live there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm laughing, but it's not funny. I'm laughing because I'm disgusted. But you mentioned, the chemical attacks, and all of a sudden we've seen a new flurry. Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, said, I think just yesterday, that the U.S. is very concerned about chemical weapons use in Syria. Why are we seeing this again? Does it make any sense that Assad would use a little bit of chlorine gas? I think the last attack, he made one person ill. You go from this guy being a mass murderer, killing hundreds of thousands, to now he makes someone a little ill. What is behind all of this?
I mean, it's insane, isn't it? And what happens? When do these chemical weapon attack spikes happen in propaganda? Of course, almost always as the Syrian Arab army is making military advances and as Russia is brokering peace, as, for example, recently in Sochi. And then we suddenly see the white helmets who, we know that Syria is another, in inverted commas, humanitarian war. A responsibility to protect war, and what better to further that humanitarian war than a faux humanitarian organization that is there to produce and amplify these chemical weapon stories. Now, I can tell you from my time in Damascus, at one point I was only about 100 meters from the front lines in East Ghouta. Now, that is what is known as a military zone. In other words, there's Syrian Arab army around those areas, around Eastern Ghouta, for example, working with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, working with the Russian humanitarian organization and the Syrian civil society organizations who are working to gradually take out civilians from those terrorist-occupied areas for medical treatment, for safety, and just to get them out of those areas so that they can finally either negotiate with the armed factions and evacuate them under the amnesty agreement on the green buses to Idlib, or of course to finally push forward militarily and cleanse them out of these residential eastern suburbs. But to even imagine that the Syrian government would use, one, such an ineffectual weapon, as you point out, but to use a weapon, any sort of, even if it had them, which it doesn't, we know that, in an area where it's going to affect its own forces, the forces of its allies, the forces of its own humanitarian organizations, or the members of its own humanitarian organizations and its own civilians, is sort of insane. And again, those reports are, of course, being propagated by the white helmets, not by anybody else.
And I think we had a little glimpse into the real reality a couple of days ago when Defense Secretary Mattis said, "Yeah, they better stop using those chemical weapons. We're about ready to go in there, but we have no evidence that they've used it." So, they're not even going through the motions of doing an investigation now. anything that happens, it's blamed on them.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to close it, but I can't resist just bringing up one more short thing, if I can indulge you. And this is sort of one of my pet peeves. You know, a subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee had a hearing yesterday, you know, and I lived through more than a decade of this. They would have a hearing on a topic, they would pick all of the witnesses, would have the exact same perspective, and that would be the foregone conclusion of the leadership of the House. I don't think this is anything different. So here's the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It's a subcommittee on the Middle East, talking about Syria. Here are their three witnesses, Vanessa. Robert Ford, former ambassador to Syria, really the godfather of this horrible disaster. Charles Lister, and Faisal Itani, who's with the Atlantic Council. These are their three experts. This is the full range of opinion that the House members will see. No wonder they're so well informed, right?
I mean, this is frightening, isn't it? You know, I mean, Robert Ford, I've had a number of debates with him actually on Twitter messaging. And he's objected very strongly to my alluding to his creation of death squads in a number of war theatres on behalf of the United States administration. And yet, you know, in Syria, we know that he was instrumental in creating the Free Syrian Army, the so-called moderate extremists who supported and approved of ISIS. So in my opinion, those are death squads that he created yet again inside Syria. Charles Lister did the great job of deciding that there were up to, I think, 70,000 moderate extremists fighting in Syria. So, you know, these are pure fantasies, but fantasy that leads to the prolonged suffering and criminal activities by these proxy groups of terrorists who, you know, whether you call them ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they work under the same banner, they have the same ideology, and that ideology, if left to run riot in Syria, would ensure the massacre of the minorities that do not comply to that religious ideology throughout Syria. And this is what people like Ford and Lister are criminally supporting.
You know, the real disaster in a way is that this is the only thing that members of the House of Representatives will hear about Syria.
Yeah.
Because they rig these hearings, they rig them. These guys, they don't have a lot, they're not going to be searching out Vanessa Beeley and looking at your counter research and your factual based research. They don't have the time, they don't have the interest, they don't have the inclination. Oh yeah, I went to a hearing, I saw this guy Lister, he sounded like he made a lot of sense. He had a nice British accent, he must know a lot, you know. But I'm gonna leave you with a quote. This is Lister yesterday. He's come up with a grand new scheme, a grand new plan. Here's how we're gonna fix Syria. He said, the US should use vetted Syrian opposition groups to defend Israel from Iranian moves near the Syrian border and to block any further regime consolidation. This is what he told the committee yesterday. Is that not incredible?
That's incredible, isn't it? When the United States is effectively occupying illegally the northeast of Syria, Israel is occupying the south of Syria, and Turkey is trying to annex the northwest. I mean, you know, the very fact that Lister doesn't allude to any of this, let alone the financing of terrorism, the arming of terrorism. And Israel, by the way, has bombed again the outskirts of Damascus today. I mean, this is just complete rogue statehood gone crazy, with people like Lister giving it some veneer of respectability. Yeah. They're criminals, all of them. They're criminals for what they're facilitating inside Syria.
Absolutely. Well, Vanessa, we do have to cut it off there. It's always great getting your insights. I'm so glad you keep working. Be careful, because you have a lot of enemies. You have the right kind of enemies. And thanks so much for giving us your time today.
Oh, you're welcome, Daniel. Thank you so much for having me back on.
And I want to thank all of our viewers at the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Thanks for watching. We provide you the real news. Be sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please come back and see us again soon.